The jungle was burning. It was June 1944, somewhere on the island of Saipan. The air was a haze of smoke and salt, the echo of naval shells rolling across the ridges like thunder. In a shallow dugout near the shattered edge of a palm grove, a Japanese radio operator hunched over his set. A Type 94 field transmitter, its dials slick with sweat and dust. The cordite stung his eyes. His unit had been out of contact for nearly 20 hours. The aerial wire had been hit. The receiver hissed nothing but static. Around him, soldiers whispered that the radio was finished. Dead, like the men outside who hadn't returned. He tapped the transmitter again, adjusting the tuning coil with trembling hands. A faint pulse of sound answered, a heartbeat through the noise. He leaned closer, lips almost touching the mic. His voice cracked through the interference, a final coded message sent into the void. No one around him knew it yet, but that last message, thought to be impossible, would shift the course of the battle above the smoking beaches of Saipan. The screen fades from the flicker of the transmitter to the wide expanse of the Pacific. A war stretched over thousands of miles, by mid-1944. The Pacific had become a graveyard of Japan's early victories. 2 years earlier, their empire had stretched from Burma to the edges of New Guinea, an oceanic fortress built on speed, surprise, and fanatic resolve. But that empire was now shrinking, island by island, under the relentless advance of American power. The fall of the Marshalls, the destruction of the Imperial Navy at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and the capture of strategic airfields by U.S. Marines all pointed to one reality. Japan was being pushed toward its homeland. Each island taken brought American bombers a few hundred miles closer to Tokyo. Saipan, part of the Mariana Islands chain, was more than another patch of coral and jungle. It was a gateway. From Saipan, B-29 bombers could strike the Japanese home islands directly. Tokyo knew that if Saipan fell, Japan's defensive perimeter would collapse. That's why nearly 30,000 Japanese troops, under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sate, dug in to fight to the death. For the men on the ground, this wasn't strategy. It was survival. In the days before the American landings, Japanese engineers had carved tunnels through coral hills, positioned artillery in hidden caves, and strung communication wires through the jungle. Each infantry company relied on small, portable field radios, the Type 94 and Type 97 sets, fragile lifelines in a war of noise and chaos. Their range was short, barely 5 miles under ideal conditions, but they connected outposts to artillery observers and command posts buried deep inland. When the American assault began on June 15, 1944, the island shook under the fire of 7 battleships and 11 cruisers. Entire beaches erupted into fountains of sand and steel. The Japanese defenders had no air cover, little naval support, and no reinforcements on the horizon. Their only chance was coordination, artillery strikes timed to the second, counterattacks guided by radio messages that could mean the difference between annihilation and a few more hours of defense. But under bombardment, those lines of communication began to die. Antennas snapped. Batteries failed. Operators were killed at their posts. The tropical heat, salt air, and constant shock from explosions made Japanese field equipment unreliable. Many units resorted to couriers, soldiers running messages through artillery zones, often never returning. Among these fractured networks sat one small signal detachment near the island's southern ridge. Their responsibility was to maintain contact between forward infantry and an inland artillery group overlooking the beaches. When their main antenna was destroyed by naval gunfire, the radio team tried to re-establish a link using improvised copper wire and fragments of bamboo. They succeeded, briefly. Then the static swallowed them again. For hours, the command post heard nothing. It was assumed the team was gone, either killed or cut off. But somewhere amid the smoke and shattered palm trees, one operator, his name lost in the reports, refused to accept silence. He stayed with his radio, hand-tuning the circuits through the night, even as the ground around him burned. This was the context in which that single, dying message would later echo, not as a legend, but as a moment buried within the brutal logic of a collapsing defense. The Japanese still believed communication could salvage what was left of Saipan's garrison. But the truth was darker. Every transmission now carried the sound of an empire breaking apart. From this chaos of failing signals and desperate coordination, we move deeper into the heart of the Pacific War, into the system that held Japan's far-flung forces together and how it began to fail under American pressure. Japan's military machine in 1944 was fighting two wars, one against the enemy and one against time. For years, the Imperial Japanese Army had built its doctrine on discipline, endurance, and communication through hierarchy. Orders flowed from Tokyo to regional commands, then to island garrisons scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. In theory, it was precise. In reality, it was crumbling. The empire's reach had stretched its infrastructure to the breaking point. Supplies were late, fuel was scarce, and spare radio parts were nearly impossible to replace. Every island outpost became a self-contained world, forced to improvise with whatever it had. By mid-1944, Japanese commanders were often working with radios built before the war, heavy, fragile sets running on dying batteries, strung together with salvaged parts from other wrecked units. The Americans, meanwhile, had mastered the art of communication warfare. Their SCR series radios, the SCR-300 and SCR-536 Handatalkie, were rugged, mass-produced, and easy to operate. These devices gave every U.S. platoon the ability to coordinate in real time, even under fire. They relayed artillery calls, medical requests, and tactical adjustments faster than any Japanese command structure could respond. On Saipan, this imbalance was devastating. Japanese radio signals were short-range and vulnerable to terrain. The island's ridges, caves, and dense jungle scattered transmissions like echoes. To maintain a line of contact between forward troops and artillery, operators had to position themselves dangerously close to the front, within range of naval shells and American snipers. It was not uncommon for entire signal teams to be wiped out within hours of battle. Each time that happened, command posts would fall silent, unable to direct artillery or call for reinforcements. In the diaries of captured Japanese officers, one theme repeats: "Our lines are cut again." Without reliable communication, even bravery became meaningless. Units fought in isolation, unaware of the bigger picture. Some counterattacked into areas already lost. Others held positions long after their flanks had collapsed. General Saite's headquarters on Saipan relied heavily on reports from field operators. When those reports stopped coming, decisions turned into guesses. American troops advancing inland often found Japanese machine gun nests firing blindly, unaware that the front line had already shifted. To maintain control, the Japanese used runners, young soldiers carrying handwritten messages through artillery storms. But as American air and naval bombardment intensified, even that system disintegrated. By the fourth day of fighting, the command structure had fractured into isolated pockets. Still, the doctrine of the Imperial Army demanded one thing: never surrender. Each unit was expected to fight until destroyed, no matter what. The men who manned those radios knew that failure meant silence, and silence meant annihilation. Somewhere within this collapsing network of broken signals was the small radio team from our opening scene. Their Type 94 set had been damaged, its antenna destroyed, and its range reduced to a whisper. Yet through exhaustion and desperation, one operator kept adjusting the circuits, using stripped wire and bits of copper scavenged from wrecked trucks to rebuild his transmitter. What he didn't know was that his frequency, weak and unstable, was still being monitored at a nearby Japanese artillery post. For hours, the receiver picked up nothing but static. Then, at dawn, a faint pulse began to break through the noise. That pulse would become a message that altered how the defenders fought their final hours on Saipan. It was not heroism in the Hollywood sense. It was duty carried out in darkness, a signal that refused to die, echoing through the last days of an empire. As the larger war raged beyond Saipan, what happened in that dugout reflected the struggle of the entire Japanese army. A fight not just for land, but for connection itself. Next, we'll examine this battle from multiple perspectives: human, tactical, and technological, to understand why that moment mattered: the human angle, the silent frontline. To be a radio operator in the Imperial Japanese Army was to live between two worlds, the human and the mechanical. Signalmen were trained not only to fight but to listen. They were the ears of the battlefield, connecting scattered companies to command centers miles away. Their work demanded precision under chaos, calm under fire, and a devotion to accuracy so absolute that even death was preferable to a missent word. In 1944, most of these operators were barely 20 years old. Many had come from technical schools, drawn by the prestige of working with advanced equipment. Yet on islands like Saipan, the war stripped away that illusion. Their radios were heavy, their equipment outdated, and the humidity destroyed circuits faster than bullets could. Still, they remained at their posts, buried in earth bunkers lit only by the glow of a flickering vacuum tube. They heard the battle differently from the infantry. Where others saw flashes and smoke, they heard the constant rhythm of static, the distant pulse of friendly stations, the slow fade of voices that never returned. Every time a signal vanished, it meant another position lost, another comrade gone. In the imperial code of Bushido, duty transcended survival. For a radio operator, that meant one thing: the signal must never fall silent. Even if surrounded, even if out of ammunition, even if the enemy was only meters away, the transmitter had to stay alive. That belief drove countless men to their final transmissions. One Japanese signalman, recorded posthumously in the war logs of the 31st Army, had tapped out his last message from a burning bunker: enemy advancing. This is the end. Seconds later, the line went dead. Such moments became the unspoken history of Japan's defense, small flickers of humanity drowned in the static of total war. On Saipan, our unknown operator was one of them. A man who chose to keep listening when silence had already claimed the battlefield around him. His persistence would carry consequences far beyond his small circle of shattered earth. The technological angle, the fragile lifeline. By 1944, Japanese communication technology was no longer keeping pace with the demands of modern warfare. The Type 94 field radio, the workhorse of Japan's infantry units, had been designed in the early 1930s. It was portable by mule or man, weighed nearly 70 pounds with its batteries, and operated within a narrow frequency range of 2.5 to 5 MHz. Under perfect conditions, it could reach 5 miles, but on Saipan's rugged terrain, its range dropped to less than half. Power was always a problem. The radio ran on dry cell batteries that degraded quickly in tropical climates. Operators often carried spare units wrapped in wax paper, but heat and humidity corroded the terminals within days. When that happened, desperate crews used makeshift fixes, batteries scavenged from vehicles, hand-cranked generators, even stripped copper wiring pulled from wrecked aircraft. Every transmission required delicate calibration. The operator had to manually tune the coils while adjusting for frequency drift caused by heat and vibration. One slip of the dial and the signal would vanish into the noise. Meanwhile, American forces enjoyed an entirely different reality. The SCR-300 backpack radio allowed clear voice communication across miles, with rugged casing and reliable power supply. Infantry leaders could call for air or artillery support in seconds, something their Japanese counterparts could only dream of. To compensate, Japanese doctrine leaned on prearranged plans and time-based coordination. Instead of dynamic, real-time commands, they relied on synchronization. Artillery would fire at preset times. Infantry would attack on cue, regardless of what was happening on the ground. It was a system born of necessity, but it lacked flexibility. When a Japanese field radio failed, the effect rippled instantly. Artillery shells might fall too short, counterattacks might strike empty positions, and reinforcements might arrive hours too late. On an island like Saipan, where every meter of ground was contested, those seconds mattered. That's why one working radio, even a damaged one, could alter everything. When the operator in the dugout managed to revive his failing Type 94, he wasn't just restoring a piece of equipment. He was re-establishing Japan's last thread of control over a battle already slipping away. The human and technological sides of this story intertwine here. A man's persistence and a machine's fragility meeting in the same desperate hour. But to grasp what made that signal so decisive, we must see the war through other lenses too, the tactical and leadership perspectives that determined how each message translated into life or death. The tactical angle, when silence means death. In war, silence is often worse than defeat. For the Japanese defenders on Saipan, communication wasn't a luxury, it was their only weapon left. The Americans advanced inland with overwhelming coordination. Infantry, armor, artillery, and aircraft moved as one machine, linked by continuous radio chatter. Marine forward observers could call in naval gunfire within minutes. Every squad had a voice that could reach command. By contrast, Japanese positions were blind and deaf the moment their radios failed. General Saito's defensive plan relied on a delicate chain. Infantry along the coast would report American beachhead progress, artillery inland would adjust fire based on those reports, and reserve units would strike where gaps appeared. But when the first bombardments hit, those lines broke instantly. Wires melted, antennas shattered, and runners never returned. Entire sectors of the island fell silent. This breakdown was catastrophic because the Japanese defense depended on timing. Artillery had to hit precisely where U.S. tanks broke through. Counterattacks had to launch before Marines dug in. Without those updates, command could do nothing but wait for explosions in the distance. Signals of defeat carried not by radio, but by sound and smoke. When the unknown operator managed to send his last message, it wasn't a heroic improvisation, it was a tactical resurrection. That single signal allowed Japanese artillery to correct its fire on the advancing 105th U.S. Infantry Regiment near the southern ridge. For a brief, violent hour, the American advance faltered under unexpected shell bursts. Reports from captured U.S. communications later confirmed enemy fire suddenly accurate again. Possible surviving observer transmitting. In that moment, one faint radio pulse had reconnected a broken battlefield, if only for a while. The leadership angle, command in collapse. At the top of Saipan's defense stood Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, a career soldier shaped by the Imperial Army's strict doctrines. His orders were clear: Saipan must not fall. But leadership in collapse is not command, it's endurance. By June 25, the Japanese positions were fractured into isolated pockets. Saito's own headquarters had lost reliable contact with most of the front. Officers shouted orders that no one heard. Maps were days out of date. Yet still, the general insisted on holding communication discipline, even if it meant shouting into silence. To the Japanese, radio signals weren't just technical tools. They were a voice of authority, the last echo of the emperor's command across the battlefield. Each operator, each encoded word, carried moral weight. To keep transmitting was to keep obeying. When the damaged signal from the southern ridge reached the inland artillery command, it carried not only coordinates but proof. There were still men fighting out there. That message allowed Saito to authorize one of his final counterstrikes, a desperate attempt to push the Americans back toward the beach. It failed, of course. The Americans held their ground and tightened the noose. But the order itself mattered. For Saito's command, the signal meant that the army still existed as a structure, not just scattered survivors in caves. And in war, perception can shape reality, even for a few hours. The enemy angle, the sound of the invisible. To the Americans, Japanese radio signals were both mystery and opportunity. By 1944, U.S. intelligence units had developed sophisticated interception systems. On Saipan, mobile signal teams listened constantly for Japanese frequencies. They couldn't always decode the messages, but they could locate them. Once detected, artillery or aircraft would target the source within minutes. This made every Japanese transmission an act of self-sacrifice. Operators knew that the longer they stayed on air, the shorter their lives became. Still, the operator in the dugout kept sending. His signal, weak, flickering, buried in static, was too faint for U.S. direction finders to triangulate. It slipped beneath the American detection threshold, evading the systems that hunted stronger signals. Ironically, the damage that almost silenced him also saved him, for a time. Later, captured U.S. after-action reports mentioned sporadic low-frequency enemy traffic during the final phase of the battle, describing it as fragmented but persistent. To intelligence officers, it was nothing. To the men on the ground, it was everything. In these intersecting angles, tactical, leadership, enemy, we see the full weight of that moment. One man's perseverance became a node in a failing empire's nervous system. His voice bridged the gap between chaos and command, if only for a few breaths of history. And as Saipan descended into its final, desperate hours, that fragile signal would become the spark that triggered Japan's last great counterattack. The moment when the defenders chose death over surrender, guided by a transmission that should never have existed. From these converging forces, the story now rises toward its breaking point. The climax, when the island's defenders launched their final stand and the fate of the Pacific shifted forever. The sun rose over Saipan like a furnace. It was June 27, 1944. The American flag already flew over parts of the island, but resistance continued in shattered pockets. Every cave, every ridge, hid men who refused to believe the battle was lost. At the southern edge of the island, the remnants of Japan's 136th Infantry Regiment clung to their positions. Their trenches were half filled with water and ash. Many had no ammunition left. Others fought with bayonets and grenades salvaged from the dead. Above them, U.S. aircraft prowled, their engines a constant growl that never faded. The radio team's dugout had survived another night. The walls were black with soot, the air thick with dust. Inside, the operator, his uniform torn, his face burned, leaned over the Type 94 transmitter one last time. He had been trying to raise the Inland Artillery Command since midnight. Static. Always static. Then, just after dawn, the tone changed. A thin, rhythmic pulse began to form, like breathing through the storm. He adjusted the tuning coil, his fingers trembling. Slowly, through the interference, a voice emerged. Ridge sector, confirm position, request coordinates. He froze. The signal was faint but real, a fragment from the inland command post. The line was alive again. Outside, his unit was preparing for annihilation. American Sherman tanks were pushing through the brush, supported by flamethrowers and Marine rifle squads. The defenders had minutes, maybe less. The operator switched frequencies, matching his set to the command post's receiver. His field notes, soaked and torn, contained prearranged artillery grid codes. He tapped the key, transmitting short, coded bursts, the location of advancing U.S. armor, the direction of movement, the density of troops. It was a message that should have been impossible. In the command post 2 kilometers inland, a weary officer heard the faint Morse pattern crackle through the static. Source, Southern Ridge, the clerk wrote beside the entry. Coordinates followed. Artillery crews adjusted their range and direction. 3 batteries, 75 mm and 105 mm guns. At 7:23 hours, the first Japanese shells landed. The American advance halted in shock. Columns of smoke rose from the ridge, scattering Marine formations. U.S. units radioed their own headquarters, unexpected enemy fire, heavy concentration, adjust counter-battery. In that moment, the battlefield's tempo changed. For the first time in days, Japanese artillery hit where it mattered, accurate, synchronized, relentless. For nearly 40 minutes, the ridge became a storm of fragmentation shells and machine gun bursts. Marines were forced to pull back under the sudden, coordinated barrage. To American observers, it looked as though the Japanese had somehow regrouped. To the Japanese, it felt like resurrection. Proof that command still lived, that they were not fighting alone. But in the dugout, the operator knew the truth. Each transmission weakened his set further. The antenna was a twisted mess of wire and bamboo, vibrating with every explosion. The batteries were almost dead. The transmitter's coils were glowing red-hot, emitting a faint smell of burning insulation. Still, he stayed on air, correcting coordinates, relaying impact reports as the artillery fired round after round. It was his world now, a rhythm of code and thunder, of signal and echo. Around 8 o'clock, his comrades outside began to shout. American infantry had closed in again. The sky filled with the roar of flamethrowers. Fire swept across the trench line, consuming everything. Inside the bunker, the operator didn't look up. He sent one final burst, 4 short, 1 long, the prearranged code meaning continue fire until no reply. A moment later, the dugout collapsed under an explosion. The radio went silent. But the signal had already done its work. For another hour, the inland artillery batteries continued to fire blindly toward the coordinates last sent. Their shells slowed the American advance, delaying the capture of the southern sector by half a day. It bought time, not for victory, but for one final act of defiance. Reports from the U.S. 105th Infantry described renewed enemy resistance, likely directed fire from concealed observer positions. They didn't know that the observer had already fallen silent beneath the earth. What followed next would be one of the most violent moments of the entire Saipan campaign. A counterattack born from that single message, a last eruption of fury before the island's end. From this desperate communication came the spark that ignited Japan's last coordinated assault, the massed banzai charge that would turn Saipan into a nightmarish scene of chaos and sacrifice. The Japanese called it Gyokusai, the honorable death, the shattering of the jewel. To die resisting was not defeat. It was the fulfillment of duty. In the hours following that last radio message, General Saite's staff gathered within the remnants of their headquarters near Mount Tapachor. The air reeked of burnt oil and smoke. Runners brought reports, fragmented, contradictory, but one detail stood out. The southern ridge was still transmitting. That meant survivors. It meant someone was still fighting. Saite ordered his remaining officers to prepare for what he called the final offensive of the Saipan army. It would not be strategic. It would be symbolic. Every man still able to stand, soldiers, laborious, even hospital patients, would attack at dawn. The radio, silent now, had rekindled the illusion of connection. For a few fleeting hours, they believed that somewhere beyond the smoke, comrades were still answering. The morning of July 7, 1944 arrived under a veil of grey mist. American forces, exhausted after weeks of fighting, were regrouping near the village of Tanapag. Most believed the battle was over. Then, just before 5 a.m., the jungle began to move. From the tree line emerged the sound, first a murmur, then a roar, the collective cry of thousands. Nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers charged forward, screaming the word that had become both prayer and defiance, Tenno Haika Banzai. Long live the Emperor. It was the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. They came in waves, officers with drawn swords, infantrymen with fixed bayonets, medics with rifles taken from the fallen. Even the wounded were carried forward, bandaged heads glowing white against the dawn. Among them marched the remnants of the southern ridge, men who had survived under the very artillery the last signal had guided. The Americans were caught off guard. The 105th Infantry Regiment, still holding the same sector struck by the earlier artillery, faced the full force of the charge. Machine guns opened fire, mowing down the first ranks. Mortars followed, but the mass kept coming. They crashed into the American line with ferocity that defied reason. Hand-to-hand combat broke out along the trenches. Some Marines fired until their barrels overheated. Others fought with shovels, bayonets, or bare hands. By mid-morning, the field was a tangle of bodies. Thousands of Japanese soldiers cut down in a single storm of violence. Entire American companies were overrun before regrouping. The U.S. 105th Infantry lost more than 650 men in a matter of hours, one of the highest single-day losses of any regiment in the Pacific Campaign. When the gunfire finally subsided, Saipan was silent. The Japanese command was gone. General Saite, along with Admiral Nagumo, the same officer who had once led the attack on Pearl Harbor, committed suicide near their cave headquarters. The island was effectively conquered. Yet in the post-battle reports, U.S. officers noticed something strange. The timing of the banzai charge coincided almost exactly with the artillery barrage from 2 days earlier, the one directed by that faint radio signal. It was as if the last transmission had not only shifted the battle tactically, but emotionally, restoring the will of an army on the brink of collapse. That single voice, thought lost, had given the illusion of coordination, the belief that command still existed, that the Emperor's army was still one. In that illusion, thousands found their reason to die. Later, when U.S. Marines swept the southern ridge, they found the remnants of the radio dugout. The equipment was half-melted, the Type 94's casing twisted from heat. The antenna, bamboo and wire, still leaned against the crater wall. In the logbook beside it were a few final notations, each line ending with the same character repeated 3 times, transmitting. They buried the operator where he had fallen. No name was recorded. That last message, a fragment of Morse code barely audible through the static, had no grand intention. It was routine, coordinates, observations, a report like thousands before it. But through that tiny spark of persistence, an empire already collapsing managed to rise one last time in defiance. For the Americans, it was another victory, brutal, necessary, and final. For the Japanese, it was the sound of a dying nation speaking one last time through a machine built for war. The signal was gone. The operator was gone. But his message, unknowingly, had become the drumbeat of Japan's last great charge. A storm that consumed both sides in fire and faith. As the smoke cleared over Saipan, the world shifted. Japan's defensive ring in the Pacific had been broken. The path to the Mariana airfields lay open, and with it, the road to Tokyo itself. But even in victory, the Americans sensed something unsettling. They had faced not just soldiers, but a force bound together by invisible threads. Threads of duty, code, and belief carried through the air by men like the one who refused to let his radio die. The climax ends here, with the island burning, the Empire's last roar fading into the static of history. Next, we'll move into the aftermath, how this battle changed both sides, in strategy, psychology, and the wider course of the war. When the guns finally fell silent on July 9, 1944, the Battle of Saipan was over. But for those who survived, silence was not peace, it was shock. The landscape was unrecognizable. Palm trees stood scorched and splintered like spears. The once green ridges had been turned to ash. American medics moved through the ruins with stretchers, stepping over shell casings and shattered radios. The air hung thick with the smell of decay and diesel fuel. Out of nearly 32,000 Japanese soldiers who had defended the island, fewer than 1,000 were taken prisoner. The rest had died in combat, suicide, or the Banzai charge. Among them were countless civilians, families who, convinced by propaganda that the Americans would torture or enslave them, leapt from the cliffs rather than surrender. For the U.S. Marines and Army infantrymen, victory brought no joy. It had been the bloodiest battle yet in the Pacific. Over 3,400 Americans were killed and nearly 11,000 wounded. The cost was immense, but the reward was strategic beyond measure. Saipan was not just another island, it was the gateway to Japan's heart. From its newly captured airfields, the U.S. Army Air Forces could now deploy B-29 Superfortresses directly against the Japanese mainland. Tokyo was suddenly within range. In the command tents of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz studied the first reconnaissance photographs from Saipan. The long, flat airstrips were already being cleared for use. Engineers worked around the clock to repair runways and fortify bases. To Nimitz, this was the moment when the tide of war stopped turning and began to surge forward. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the shock struck Tokyo like thunder. When news of Saipan's fall reached the Imperial General Headquarters, it was not just a military loss, it was a revelation. The Emperor's ministers realized that the outer defensive perimeter had been breached. The Americans were now close enough to bomb the home islands themselves. On July 18, 1944, just 9 days after Saipan's fall, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned along with his entire cabinet. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan's political leadership collapsed under the weight of defeat. The radio operators in Tokyo, once flooded with coded reports from garrisons across the Pacific, found the airwaves eerily silent. The transmission from Saipan, replayed and analyzed, was among the last they would ever receive from that front. It became a symbol in military briefings, even in isolation, duty continues. But beneath the official rhetoric, officers whispered about futility. They knew that if Saipan could fall, no island was safe. For the Americans, the victory carried its own lessons. The ferocity of the Japanese defense, the suicidal charges, the refusal to surrender, forced a grim reassessment. Commanders began planning for future invasions with new caution. They realized that each step toward Japan would bring even greater resistance. As Major General Holland Smith, commander of the Marine Forces, later wrote, "If Saipan taught us anything, it was that Japan would fight to the last man, and the last man would not hesitate to die." That realization would shape U.S. strategy for the rest of the Pacific War. It hardened resolve, but it also sowed the seed for another, darker conclusion. If Japan would never surrender voluntarily, then only overwhelming destruction could end the war. The idea of total war, of breaking not just armies but the nation's will, began to take hold in Allied minds. And in a small, almost forgotten footnote, Saipan's last radio operator, the man whose faint transmission had guided a final burst of resistance, became part of that broader shift. His message was replayed in Tokyo, recorded by officers, and studied by post-war historians. It was the moment when technology, duty, and desperation intersected, producing both courage and tragedy. But the human story did not end there. Beyond strategy and politics, Saipan had changed something deeper, the psychology of an empire, and the conscience of those who fought it. That's where we'll go next. For weeks after the battle, Saipan remained a graveyard. Thousands of bodies, Japanese and American alike, lay unburied under the tropical sun. The island that had once echoed with gunfire now pulsed with the low hum of flies and the distant crackle of construction crews rebuilding the airfields. In the caves and ravines, U.S. soldiers found the remnants of families who had hidden there during the bombardment. Mothers clutching children, soldiers still gripping rifles long after their hearts had stopped. It was a sight that haunted even the hardest veterans. Marine Sergeant Robert Leckie later wrote in his memoir, "We had won the island, but at a cost that no man could count. There were no victors on Saipan, only survivors." The Japanese soldiers who had refused to surrender until the very end were no longer seen as simple enemies. To many Americans, they embodied something far more complex, a mixture of fanaticism and faith, courage and tragedy. Even among the Marines who had fought them, there was an unspoken respect. They had seen men charge machine guns with bayonets and die without hesitation. They had faced opponents who viewed death not as defeat but as proof of loyalty. For Japan, the psychological wound ran even deeper. The fall of Saipan shattered the illusion of invincibility that had defined the Imperial Army since its earliest victories in China and the Pacific. The Japanese people, for the first time, began to realize that the war could be lost. In Tokyo, civilians crowded around radio sets to hear the imperial broadcast. The official statement was subdued, almost ritualistic. "Our forces on Saipan fought valiantly and met an honorable end." But beneath those words lay something unspoken, a recognition that Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was collapsing. With Saipan gone, the Mariana Islands chain was lost. The next step for the Americans would be Tinian, Guam, and then the bombing of Japan itself. And that's exactly what followed. By late 1944, the newly constructed Isley Field on Saipan became a launching point for the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Within months, the same skies once filled with Japanese Zeros now carried the distant thunder of American bombers bound for Tokyo. In a cruel twist of fate, the island that had been defended to the last man became the platform for Japan's own destruction. Historians often trace a chilling line from that final radio signal on Saipan to the fires that would later consume Japanese cities. The communication, routine, almost meaningless at the moment, had embodied everything about Japan's wartime ethos: endurance, obedience, and sacrifice. But that same ethos would later blind the nation's leaders to reality. They saw every defeat as an opportunity for martyrdom, every death as noble resistance. The result was a cascade of self-destruction, from Saipan to Okinawa, and finally to the atomic flames of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the Americans, Saipan became both a warning and a justification. It showed that Japan would fight to the death, and thus, in the minds of many Allied commanders, that ending the war by invasion would mean catastrophic losses. In post-war reflections, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral William Leahy both cited Saipan as evidence of what awaited any landing on the Japanese home islands. That reasoning would later support President Truman's decision to use atomic weapons, to force surrender without repeating the bloodbath of Saipan 100-fold. Years after the war, on the quiet cliffs of the island, locals built small memorials, stone markers, simple shrines facing the sea. One of them, half hidden by vines near the southern ridge, bears a carved message in Japanese. He transmitted to the end. May his voice rest in peace. No one knows if it truly marks the operator's grave. But to visitors, Japanese veterans, American historians, and curious travelers, it represents something universal. The moment when conviction and tragedy became one. That last signal, faint and almost lost, had outlived the man who sent it. It had become part of the island's wind, a whisper of endurance, a reminder of how far humans can go when belief outruns reason. And in that silence after victory, Saipan remained a lesson, that even the smallest act of duty can ripple through history, shaping destinies far beyond its reach. History often remembers victories in terms of territory gained or enemies defeated. But Saipan, and the voice that refused to fall silent, tells a different kind of story. It reminds us that even in the most mechanical of wars, where men fought through machines and distance, the human heartbeat still defined everything. One operator, buried in smoke and ruin, chose not to turn away. He did not see the outcome, nor the scale of what his action would unleash. He simply did his duty, a duty that, in his mind, was sacred. That decision, to press one last key on a dying radio, became the echo of an empire's final stand. In that act lies the paradox of war itself. Technology connects, but it also destroys. Duty gives purpose, but it can also blind. The same discipline that made the Japanese soldier transmit to the end also drove thousands to their deaths believing it was honorable. And yet, within that contradiction, there is something undeniably human, the refusal to surrender to silence. After the war, as the Pacific rebuilt and Saipan turned from battlefield to memorial, historians tried to categorize what had happened. They called it strategy, fanaticism, courage, or delusion. But none of those words fully capture what that moment was. Because the truth is simpler and more haunting. A man, trained to follow code and signal, found himself in a world collapsing around him. And still, he reached for the radio. Not to change history. Not to be remembered. But because in that moment, his signal meant that someone, somewhere, might still be listening. That is the quiet power of human endurance, the instinct to connect, even in defeat. Saipan was not just another island. It was the moment the Pacific War crossed from courage into tragedy, from empire to ashes. And buried beneath that transformation was one faint, stubborn transmission, the sound of belief refusing to die. In the static of that last message, we can still hear what war truly leaves behind. Not glory, not victory, but the echo of voices reaching through the noise, hoping to be heard.